It's my pleasure to welcome everyone today, whether you're in the hall now or watching us online. Another free event offered by the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara. I'm Kirk Gradine, and I'll be introducing our speaker. Under this year's overarching theme of Concord and Community, Margo McLoughlin will be presenting on timeless tales, communal bonds through storytelling. The Institute was founded in downtown Santa Barbara by Raghavan and Nandini Iyer in 1976. And Nandini Iyer was a brilliant teacher of comparative religion and mysticism who taught both at UCSB and the local city college for many years. Her husband, Raghavan Iyer, was a professor of political philosophy at UCSB, while also being a wise and radiant spiritual teacher, possessing a rich scholarly understanding and insight into many world religions, including that of Buddhism. And in fact, among the many books that he wrote or edited is this one, a 550-page volume titled The Dhammapada and Udarna Varga. These are two well-known Buddhist texts. The Dhammapada is revered by many, if not all, schools of Buddhism as being an authentic representation of the oral transmission given by the Buddha in the 6th century before the Common Era. And it is beautifully rendered in this edition and includes a 5-chapter introduction by Professor Iyer that gives a comprehensive overview both of the life of the Buddha, his night of enlightenment, and the fundamental teaching that he gave, and then the many schools, diverging schools of Buddhism that emerged in the centuries and decades after the Buddha, including how it spread into northern India and Tibet. And it's well worth reading for any who are interested in the tradition. And I just, since also tomorrow is, as many of you probably know, celebrated every year as Buddha Jayanti, which is the first full moon in May, typically. It's the calendar day is according to the lunar calendar, but it celebrates the birthday, the day of enlightenment, and the death day of Gautama Buddha, all occurring on the same calendar day. And it's celebrated by all Buddhists throughout the world each year. And so we're very lucky to have Margo telling us about the Jataka tales, which, again, if you don't know, these are the literal translation of the word Jataka has to do with birth tales. That is, they're the lives leading up to the life of the Buddha, the many hundreds of lives that he passed through in his progress towards awakening as the Buddha. And they've emerged with the very earliest texts that came out of the Buddhist tradition. So they're very ancient. But in celebration of and in honor of Buddha Jayanti, I wanted to read just a few passages from the Dhammapada. This is from chapter 8, called The Thousands. Better than 1,000 utterances comprising words without sense is a single word full of meaning, on hearing which one finds peace. Better than reciting 100 verses comprising words without sense is a single verse full of meaning, on hearing which one finds peace. Better indeed is self-conquest than the conquest of others. If a man subdues himself and practices restraint, neither a god, nor an angel, nor Mara, together with Brahma, can undo his victory. A little bit more about the Institute. Again, most of you here know that it's a nonprofit educational center dedicated to serving both the local and global community through seminars, forums, study groups, and now via live-streamed presentations on diverse aspects of world culture. All of its activities are dedicated to the promotion of universal brotherhood and the fostering of human fellowship among all races, nations, and cultures. And please check out our website when you get a chance, worldculture.org. Here you can subscribe to the monthly newsletter and announcements for all upcoming events. And we also have a YouTube channel, which is functioning right now as we speak, IWC in Santa Barbara, and where you'll find dozens of previous events that have been recorded. All the activities of the Institute arise from or are based on its 10 aims, and today's presentation is related most directly to aim number 5, to deepen awareness of the universality of man's spiritual striving and its rich variety of expression in the religions, philosophies, and literatures of humanity. And number 9, to assist in the emergence of men and women of universal culture, capable of continuous growth in nonviolence of mind, generosity of heart, and harmony of soul. Our speaker today, Margo McLoughlin, grew up in Vancouver, Canada. She studied theater, linguistics, and philosophy at Laval University in Quebec City and completed her undergraduate degree at McGill in Montreal. She studied Sanskrit, Pali, and world religions at Harvard, where she received a Master of Divinity. With colleagues, she co-facilitated community building retreats with the Mississippi Center for Justice in Jackson and the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation in Oxford, Mississippi. She's worked as a puppeteer, a cook, and a chaplain. Many modes of livelihood. And from 2011 to 2012, she was artist in residence at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. Margo has been practicing in the insight tradition of Theravada Buddhism since 1986. In 2012, she completed her training to be a community Dharma leader at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Woodacre, California. And she now leads evening classes and non-residential retreats on Vancouver Island and in neighboring communities. She also, over the course of her career, has collected more than 200 folk tales from world cultures on the theme of generosity. And she's written 2 books based on that research. One is called Seeds of Generosity, Storytelling in the Classroom, and The Giving Heart, Folk Tales for Exploring Generosity. She's also written stories herself and has a children's book called I Know a Crow, illustrated by Joe Zinar. So I give you Margo McLoughlin.
Well, thank you so much, Kirk, for that introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak today on a topic that is dear to my heart, stories and the rich storytelling tradition that arises out of Southeast Asia and the Buddhist teachings. But I want to begin with an acknowledgement, and that is that I'm joining you from the West Coast, from an island off the east coast of Vancouver Island, Cortez, and it is the traditional territories of the Klahus, the Homalco, and the Tlaman peoples whose own storytelling traditions continue to this day. And I also want to acknowledge that being of Western descent, European descent, I come to Buddhist practice and the Buddhist teachings as a explorer myself, and I am deeply nourished by the great teachers, Asian and Western, who have brought these teachings forward in the last 2,500, 2,600 years. So let's begin and we'll take you on a bit of a journey today with these stories that are known as the Jataka tales. So as Kirk was saying, the word Jataka is a composite of jati, which means birth, and the ka from kateti, to relate, to recount, to tell. So birth stories, the birth stories that recount the previous lives of the Buddha. So it's a wonderful kind of framework to think of lifetime after lifetime arising from one moment of encounter. So according to the legends, the stories, in a previous lifetime,
I turned off the speaker. Is that okay?
A young man named Sumedho encountered the Buddha of that era. So in the Buddhist worldview, there are Buddhas, a number of Buddhas who lived through the eons. So this young man, Sumedho, happened to be present when Dipankara Buddha, the Buddha of that time, was passing through his village. And seeing the radiance, and seeing the stately bearing, and hearing the words of this Buddha, he made a resolve to one day become a Buddha himself. So it is this resolve that guided him through these countless lifetimes until he was born as a young man, a prince of the Sakyan clan in an area we now think of as northeast India. So, and all kinds of legends, of course, arise around these great spiritual teachers. But according to one legend, at the time of his birth, a soothsayer, a local soothsayer, made a prophecy that either this young person coming into the world, this baby, would become a great world-turning monarch. So someone who could direct his country and his community with wisdom and compassion, or he would become a great spiritual teacher and a renunciant. So of course, the young Gautama's father, King Suddhodana, wanted his son to follow in his own footsteps. And according to legend, he did everything to make sure that his life was protected and he was shielded from any sign of suffering, aging, or death. So he grew up, and at the age of 29, he had a bit of curiosity about the world beyond the confines of his comfortable life. And of course, in Jungian tradition, we would call this the call to adventure. And in the company of a dear friend, his charioteer Chanda, he ventured out and he had encounters with what are called the 4 heavenly messengers. So at this point in the story, it's so interesting to think about how we too in our lives have moments of insight, moments of awakening, when there is a sudden shock to what we see as normal, acceptable, safe, and comfortable. And the first shock, or the first encounter for him, was with someone who was aged, someone whose movement, whose skin, whose eyes, whose whole demeanor indicated that they had reached an advanced age. And it's so amazing to think that he hadn't, even at the age of 29, He hadn't seen that. And the question he said to his friend Chanda was, who is that? What is that? And Chanda replied, oh, that's merely someone who has lived many decades, probably reached the venerable age of 70 or 80 or 90, who knows? And of course, the Buddha to be inquired, is that also to be my own fate? And of course the answer was yes. No one who is born escapes the journey to aging. Unless, of course, they die young. So that was the first encounter. And then the second encounter was someone who was suffering from illness. And we're not told, was this person, having a fever? Did this person, were they covered in sores, or how the illness manifested? But again, this inquiry. And again, Chanda answering Gautama, his inquiry, and asking, Siddhartha, I should say, asking him, Siddhartha asking, is that also to be my fate? And the answer, yes. You may, of course, remain healthy for many years, but the body is vulnerable. The body is prone to illness and disease. And then the last messenger was, of course, the messenger of death. And there in the street, he saw a body that had been wrapped in a white linen shroud, and that was being lifted and carried to the cremation grounds. So, again, this inquiry, where is the life gone? What is that also to be my fate? And Chanda replying, this is the truth of aging, illness, and death. By virtue of coming into the world, we must also go through these stages. So this great shock was followed by a fourth encounter with the heavenly messenger, which manifested as someone wandering through the streets, not carrying anything, whose demeanor was radiant and open and dressed in the robes of an ascetic. So Chanda explained to the young prince, this is someone who has chosen to take a step back from the worldly life and to pursue his own spiritual journey. So this is what really motivated the young prince. And it is, painful to think of the sacrifices he made to launch himself on his journey, because he left his young wife and his young son behind, and he set off on his quest. So the journey, many spiritual teachers, many encounters, many very harsh ascetic practices, and finally, he had, it's such a beautiful little incident in this unfolding story, is that he had a memory. So he had been striving, he'd been making great effort, and he'd experienced, deep states of concentration and altered mind states, but he hadn't achieved true freedom of mind. But he had a memory of a moment in childhood, sitting under a rose apple tree during a plowing festival. And he had something to eat and something to drink. There was music in the distance as this ritual plowing of the fields took place. And he was watching the birds dive into the earth and pluck out worms that were moving through the earth. And he slipped into a state of deep absorption. And remembering this incident as a young man, as a young, maybe 13, 14 years old, or perhaps even younger, he realized that there was a way to awakening that was not driven by fierce striving. And so he resolved to take his seat and find that middle way. And it just so happened, and I love this part of the story as well, that a young woman, her name was Sujata, Sujata had made a resolve that if she, after being married, if she were to bear a son as her firstborn child, she would always return to this particular tree. It was a Bodhi tree. And she would make an offering to the tree spirit that lived there. And it so happened that indeed she had given birth to a son as her firstborn. And so for a number of years, she had returned to this Bodhi tree and made an offering, usually an offering of food. But this one particular year, she returned to the Bodhi tree, and there was someone sitting under the tree. And of course, it was the Buddha-to-be. And there he is, seated in meditation, but in a sense, he is starved of nourishment. And Sujata has brought a bowl of sweet rice porridge, which she offers, thinking that this is the manifestation of the tree spirit. She offers that bowl of sweet rice porridge to the emaciated young man, and he accepts. He takes nourishment and resumes his seat and makes the resolve not to arise from his seat until he has attained awakening. So this is the kind of preamble to the Buddha's night of awakening. And of course, we can think about the role of this young woman and the nourishment that she offered, and think about the nourishment that comes to us, that sustains us on our own journey. The spiritual nourishment, and nourishment in terms of food and water, clean water, and all the supports that we receive. So this emaciated ascetic takes in the nourishment, makes the resolve, and resumes his seat under the Bodhi tree. And of course, at this point in the legend, he is assailed by Mara. Mara, of course, is the embodiment of all the negative forces that torment human beings through the ages. So he is presented with dancing girls and beautiful sounds and all the things that might distract him from his quest. And then he's assailed by the armies, 1,000 armies of Mara, who try to frighten him and disturb his concentration. And even at one point, Mara challenges him and says, "What makes you think you have the right to sit there?" And the Buddha-to-be, Siddhartha, reaches out with one hand, and you can see this in many of the representations of the Buddha, and he places his hand on the earth. As the earth is my witness, I have every right to take my seat and to free my own mind. And with that, Mara vanishes and the Buddha resumes his deep meditation. And the night proceeds. And here we have our first kind of glimpse of where his practice is taking him. So whether or not, we believe in rebirth, whether we, have had any inklings in our own lives of previous existences, or, strong connections with others with whom we might have shared a previous life. It is said that in the first watch of the night, the Buddha-to-be, with his deeply concentrated mind, he attained what are called the three knowledges. And the first one is the knowledge of his previous lifetimes. And how it's described is so interesting because it is recounted in this way. He says, I saw that I was born in such a place, with such a name, with such an experience of pleasure and of pain. And passing away from that existence, I was born in this other place, with such a name and such an experience of pleasure and pain. And passing away from there, I was born in yet another place. And so, in these vignettes, these glimpses of previous lifetimes, so we can imagine the speed at which it's almost like a speeded up slideshow, this fast motion picture frames. Oh, there I was a carpenter. Oh, there I was a charioteer. Oh, here I was the son of a wealthy merchant. And there I died quite young in an accident at sea. Oh, and there I was born as a poet. And this kind of sequence of lifetimes unfolding one after the other. So this is called the first knowledge. And then in the second watch of the night, and you can almost see the question arising, well, what drives this round of birth and death? What is the kind of energy that links all these different lifetimes? And the second watch of the night revealed to him that beings are born and reborn according to their actions. According to their actions, they experience a fortunate birth, a birth of challenge and difficulty, a birth that is mixed combination of both. And he also saw that the causality was not direct, that a person could be born to great wealth, but in that lifetime of great wealth, they might spend it all on their own personal pleasure. And then in the subsequent lifetime, they might be born in poverty, but they might be generous in that poverty and give and learn to give again, and once again be reborn to great wealth. So this sequence isn't linear, but it's fascinating to think of this deep understanding that what the Buddha eventually, as he became the Buddha and as dawn was arising, he understood the Four Noble Truths. This is the third of the three knowledges. He understood that suffering isn't personal, that suffering exists. There is dukkha, this amazing Pali word, dukkha, suffering, which is translated as dissatisfactoriness or dis-ease or stress, or just that feeling of things not quite fitting. There is dukkha. And the cause of dukkha is craving, in all the way that craving manifests. Craving after sense pleasure, craving after renewed existence, craving after fame and fortune. So, and then a craving for non-existence. So greed, hatred, and delusion is what drives the round of birth and death. So those were the first of the Four Noble Truths. Those were the first two. But he also saw there is an end to dukkha, and that end is achieved through a dedicated practice, the Eightfold Noble Path. So these, beautiful teachings encapsulated in Four Noble Truths, and also, of course, translated as the Four Ennobling Truths. the four truths that ennoble through a deep appreciation and understanding. So, the Jataka tales. The Jataka tales, well, these are the stories, many of them derived from Indian folklore, the stories reframed as the Buddha telling of his previous lifetimes, telling of ordinary encounters with good and evil, decisions that had to be made, with a desire to renounce, a desire to acquire, all the different experiences that come to human beings. So these stories offer us both a glimpse of the world of ancient India, as well as a reflection of our own encounters with all the longings that a human being meets in a lifetime. So this framework is, it's interesting to think about how really it all boils down to, it sort of synthesizes into a deep understanding of our own, you could say, our own free will. So having encountered these teachings, or any spiritual teachings that invite us to practice restraint, that invite us to pay attention to our speech, that invite us to practice generosity, to avoid harming living beings. Any of these spiritual teachings are actually asking us to be conscious in how we live. So the Jataka tales, they come down to us through the ages, like the Dhammapada that Kirk was referring to. They come down to us through the ages, and we in the West, we have our own storytelling traditions, and usually stories, of course, were about sharing an experience of hearing a story in community and having a shared language. Nowadays, our shared language of story might be around well-known films, from The Wizard of Oz to stories like films like Star Wars and the whole series, depending on your age group. And for many people, it might be musicals like Oklahoma or The Sound of Music. So this sense in which stories become a shared language and a shared experience. And the Jataka tales were often told on the full moon night, the Uposatha, so this full moon observance day. And I believe still in the villages of Southeast Asia, people would come with their families to the temple, and the monk might have learned one of the stories by heart. And he might have really taken that story into his own being and really have worked with it, understood it, and appreciated it, and then shared it for the community. And the story might be short, it might be long, and people might come and go and listen. The story might be very familiar to them, or it might be less familiar. But that experience of being in community and hearing the story would build that relationship and that kind of ongoing shared commitment to becoming human and becoming a being who is dedicated to growing and actually paying attention to what factors are influencing their state of mind. So this is about how to live. And when I was a graduate student at Harvard Divinity School, I took some wonderful courses with great professors, and one of them taught a course on Buddhism and the sacred mountain tradition. And these courses looking at how the Buddhist teachings manifest in different cultures. And as part of an essay I was writing for this course, I went and interviewed some people who had grown up in Southeast Asia. And this one lovely woman, a graduate student at Harvard, agreed to be interviewed. And her name was Kanti, which translates as patience. So her parents were devout Buddhists. They came from quite a well-to-do, land-owning, farming community. And from an early age, she was introduced to the Jataka tales, and it was her mother who would tell the stories. Sometimes, the evening would unfold and village children would come and join, or the servants and their children would join as well. And everyone would listen as her mother recounted one of the Jataka tales. And Kanti, she said sometimes the stories would go on several nights in a row. And they would be always asking her to keep the story going. And she would say, no, you have to be patient, and we will finish the story tomorrow or the next day. So for her, she said, listening to the Jataka is how I learned to be a Buddhist, is how I learned generosity and kindness and friendliness and patience and all these beautiful qualities. And she described how, because her family was quite well off, she was often in possession of objects, material, dolls or books, and she would so easily want to share them with the other children, who gratefully accepted her gifts. So for her, becoming a Buddhist was all about receiving and taking in the rich imagery of these stories. And then, of course, the stories have been depicted for centuries in cave paintings. So I'll just share, I don't know if I can share. Maybe I forgot to ask about that. Probably not. I don't think I have sharing capacity, do I? Robert?
Yes, you should be able to share.
Okay, all right. All right, let me know if you can see this.
Yes.
Can you? Okay, so just a little bit about the depiction of the Jataka. And this is a beautiful quote from a scholar, Sarah Shaw. She says, the intention of a Buddhist text must, in the end, be to wake us up. So, I'm just going to show a few more slides here. So this here we have a site of a river in India, in the Deccan Plateau. And this area, if you look, you can see that there may have been some carving into the cliff around the river. So in 1819, a young British soldier, part of the Madras army, was joining with others on a tiger hunt when he spied through the bushes this river gorge. And this led him eventually to the discovery of an amazing complex of caves and what are called vihara that had been carved in to the side of the cliffs and had been buried by the jungle over 12 centuries. So these caves had been inhabited. They'd been carved by wealthy donors, and the carvers had rappelled down the cliff faces and created these cave dwellings for the monks. And then they had painted the interiors. So this had been, when Buddhism was kind of disseminated through India and then overcome by the Mongol hordes and kind of died out in India as it traveled to other nearby countries. So this is one of the cave paintings and is seen from one of the Jataka tales. So it's really worth looking at images of the Ajanta caves. That's what this is called here. So the stories come down through visual depictions, through family retelling, telling and retelling, and nowadays in comic book form. And, I myself, I'll just stop the share for a moment and return at another point for a few more quotes. I myself encountered the stories on this very island where I am today. I was attending a silent retreat at a beautiful retreat center here called Hollyhock, tucked into the woods, with views of the ocean and the shoreline. And this was a 9-day, 10-day silent retreat. And one of the teachers, Steve Smith, had lived in Sri Lanka and heard the Jataka tales firsthand and had incorporated the telling of the Jataka into his own teaching. So here we are, we're in silent meditation, and this idea that the Buddhist text, the aim of it must be to wake us up. So, we are in silence. We're sitting, we're walking, we're opening to the teaching of the forest, the wind and the rain and the trees. And then we come in to receive the images and the beautiful unfolding of a narrative. And one of the stories he told, I will just tell you in brief, was about a poor farmer who happened to have as his only great possession a magnificent ox named Great Joy. And the farmer worked so hard, and Great Joy was a witness to the farmer's labors. But Great Joy happened to be the Buddha, to be the Bodhisattva in a previous lifetime. And so he was endowed with the gift of speech. And one day, as this poor farmer was resting after his labors, Great Joy spoke to him, and he said, "Master, you are so kind to me. Every day you bring me water, you bring me nourishment, even though you yourself are exhausted from your farming. Now, I would like to do something for you. I invite you to find the wealthiest merchant in your village and to challenge him and tell him that your ox is capable of drawing 100 carts full of rock and gravel and stone. And if you feel inclined, you might wager maybe 100 gold pieces, maybe 200, maybe 1,000. And I'm sure he will take you up on your wager." Well, at first the farmer was astonished that the ox, whom he had known and cared for over so many years, was speaking to him. But things are mysterious in this world, and so he decided to take Great Joy's advice. And he went and he knew exactly who to approach. The wealthy merchant, who indeed took great pleasure in accumulating wealth and didn't seem to have much use for it, besides more accumulation. And he approached the merchant and told him that he was wondering if perhaps that merchant might like to wager that Great Joy, the farmer's ox, could pull 100 carts full of rock and gravel and stone. And the merchant was skeptical. He said, "Foolish man, do you really think your ox can pull 100 carts? Of course, you keep him well fed. He indeed looks very strong, but I'm afraid You're not likely to win this wager. And the farmer insisted, why not give it a chance? And so the day was set. And it was the responsibility of the merchant. And he arranged and loaded up the great carts and filled them with the largest boulders he could. And one was attached to the next until this line extended in a great spiral around the village square. And so great joy was harnessed to the first of the carts, and the townspeople came, and great joy braced himself. But at the last moment, the farmer lost his nerve. He lost his confidence in great joy. And he saw his livelihood disappearing and all the accumulated wealth, very little wealth that he was in possession of. And so taking a stick that was at hand, he struck great joy on the shoulder. And he said, "Pull, you miserable beast, pull. You said you could do it, pull." But great joy did not budge an inch. Great joy said to himself, "Blows and harsh words? I cannot pull for that." And so again, the farmer struck him, but still great joy would not pull. And meanwhile, the people are laughing. Was he nuts? Was he crazy? Why did he think this would work? And so all the carts were unharnessed and great joy was led away. And the farmer was full of remorse. He sat down beside great joy and wept and said, "Oh, forgive me, my dear brother, forgive me for my harsh words and these blows." And great joy saw the sincerity of the farmer's words and invited him to renew his wager and double the amount, because, of course, the farmer had to pay out his own life savings to the wealthy merchant. And so the whole scene was repeated. And once again, great joy was there and ready to pull. And once again, the people had assembled and the carts were lined up. But this time, the farmer approached with a garland of fresh flowers. And he set it around the neck of the great ox. And this time, he laid a hand on the ox's shoulder. And he said, "Pull, my noble friend, and show your strength, and show your great beauty. Pull, pull now." And great joy sank his legs like ancient tree trunks into the earth. And leaning forward, he pulled. And with his extraordinary, noble strength, the first cart, the wheels began to turn, and then the second cart, and then the third. And as he pulled, his strength increased until there was dust in the air, and the people were cheering and laughing and celebrating. And so it was, the merchant had to pay out 2,000 gold coins. And the farmer unharnessed great joy and led him back to the stable and gave him fresh water and sweet, fresh hay and nourished him and thanked him. So, the story is about friendship, the story is about kindness, the story is about forgiveness, the story is about asking for forgiveness, but perhaps most of all, the story is about trust and faith and also the way we speak to each other. So, Steve Smith, he told the story so beautifully. And there I was, on a silent retreat, receiving the gift of these images that give us this glimpse of another world, of a village where the roads are dusty or muddy according to the season, where people live a simple life, but where wealth and poverty, as today, exists side by side. So having heard the story and other stories told by Steve, and everyone at the end of the retreat always thanks Steve for his stories, I was so moved because the stories spoke to me, and I think to all the listeners, in a different way than the lists and the concepts that are often presented as part of the teachings. We have the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, the 7 Factors of Awakening, the 10 Perfections, wonderful lists. But give me a story and I will retain some nugget, some essence, some imagery that will actually transform the way I move through the world. So having heard Steve's stories, and the story is also told by his teaching partner, Michelle, stories of her personal encounters with teachers like Deepa Ma, stories of her own struggles, I resolved myself to see if I could find my way to the original, the Pali version of the Jataka tales, and actually learn for myself how to translate and make a version of the story that was respectful of the tradition, but also accessible to a modern audience. So that was maybe 1990, 1989, that I first heard the stories. Flash forward, a decade or so, and I became a cook at the Buddhist Retreat Center, and I took a weekend course in the Pali language at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And then, a year later, there I am, I'm a scholar in residence, and I am learning how to translate. Now, in English, we have dictionaries arranged, alphabetically, A through Z or Z in American English. And it's quite easy if you're looking up a word, say you're looking for the word, maybe the word is Gambira, which means deep. Gambira, isn't that a wonderful word? And you're looking this up in a dictionary, you would go to, flip through A, F, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, ah. But no, the Pali English Dictionary is arranged according to where the sounds are produced in the mouth. So you have A, E, O, U, Ka, Ga. So it took me quite a while to figure that out. But it was like a puzzle. It might take me an hour to translate one sentence. And the grammar, of course, I had dictionaries and grammars at hand. And so I was at the Barry Center for 3 weeks and translated my first Jataka tale, which is translated as The Virtuous Elephant King, Silavanaga Jataka. And the story is really about greed and generosity. And having translated the story, I created an evening of stories and began to be a storyteller in this tradition, and just felt the transmission through the century of all those who had told those stories in the past, all those who had, really taken in some essence of the teaching, some way in which the story spoke about karma, about becoming aware, knowing that actions yield results, that an intentional action will have a specific result in the present, in the past, in the future at some point. So I began telling stories, and this particular story, the Silavanaga Jataka, in the story, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, is born as an elephant. And this is one of the most beautiful and subversive elements of the Jataka tales, is that the stories don't all represent the Buddha born as the son of a king or the son of a treasurer. He takes birth as an outcast. He takes birth as a crow or a dog who lives in a forest cemetery. So the strata of society that he represents in all these different birds shows the fluidity of lifetimes. Born in such a place, born in such a place. This kind of fluidity of birth and death. And the fact that our teachings can come to us from, a crow, from a deer, from an elephant, from a hyena, from a jackal, from a dog. So in this particular story, the Buddha to be is born as an elephant. And in the story, he lives with a herd of elephants, but they begin to bicker and argue. And he just gets fed up with all the arguing, and he goes to live alone, deep in the forest in the Himalayas. Meanwhile, a forester comes looking for trees that might be suitable for cutting down and selling for, house building, and enters the forest and gets lost. And the forester begins, as the light is falling, he is in fear for his life, that he may be devoured by wild creatures. And he begins to run through the forest, wailing and lamenting. And his wailing and lamenting catches the attention of the Bodhisattva elephant, who makes his way towards the forester. And this wonderful description of how the forester sees the elephant and is again terrified and runs. But as soon as the elephant sees the forester running, he stands still and waits for him to calm down. And the elephant is waiting, and the man looks back and sees the elephant has stopped. Finally realizes that the elephant does not mean to harm him, but to help him. And so the Bodhisattva elephant comes forward and says, "Bo Puriso, human man, why do you wander about lamenting?" And the forester replies, "Sami, my lord, I have lost my way, and I fear to perish here in this forest." "And you will not perish. Come." And so he allows the man to seat himself on his back and takes him to where he himself lives, by a stream in a glade. And the story unfolds. He cares for the man for some days and then returns him to the road in broad daylight and admonishes him and says, "Take this road now and return to the haunts of men, but tell no one of the road that leads to where I dwell." And of course the forester agrees. But as soon as he returns to his own village, he goes straight to the ivory workers' bazaar. And he watches the ivory workers there. And he sees them fashioning beautiful ornaments and trinkets, hair combs and bracelets. And he says to them, "What would you give for the tusks of a living elephant, Jivadanto. And the ivory workers, they laugh. Well, the tusks of a living elephant are worth much more than those of a dead one, but as you can well imagine, they are impossible to obtain. I shall bring you the tusks of a living elephant, says the forester. So it takes him some time, but he assembles everything he needs: a sharp saw and a rope, some supplies for the journey, and he sets off, retracing his steps and coming at last to the glade where the elephant is taking his morning bath. He has reached out his long trunk into the stream, is letting fall a shower of cool water over his great elephant ears, and the droplets are falling drop by drop. And even though his heart is filled with greed, the forester, when he sees the elephant there in the morning light, his heart is filled with wonder as well. And the elephant turning, he sees him, he says, "Bo Puriso, you have returned. Why have you come?" "Sami," says the forester, suddenly in awe of this great creature. "Sami, I am a poor wretched man. I beg of you, give me one of your tusks that I may sell it and live more easily." Now the Bodhisattva elephant, he could see that the man was filled with greed, but he himself, he had undertaken to free himself of all vestiges of stinginess and greed. And so, after pausing, he said, "Very well, you may have not one but both of my ivory tusks, if you have brought a saw to cut them with." "Oh, I have brought a saw," said the man. Well, the Bodhisattva knelt on the ground. He knelt on the ground. And the forester approached, and he placed one grimy foot against the elephant's jaw. And he began to saw and saw and saw until one tusk fell to the ground. And then, going around the elephant's trunk and propping his other foot against the elephant's jaw, he sawed again until the tusk fell to the ground. And then the elephant lifted both tusks in his trunk. He lifted them up, and he spoke to the man, and he said, "May my gift to you of these two tusks bring me insight and wisdom. And it is not because I do not hold them dear that I relinquish them, but it is for my own journey of awakening." Well, the man took the tusks and bundled them up in some rope and put them on his back, and bowing to the elephant, he set off, and he made his way back to his village. He sold the tusks for a great price, but he pretty soon had spent all the money. And then he thought to himself, tusks are just like teeth. And besides, I didn't do that great a job, and there's a little stump left right there on the elephant's face. I'll go back and get the rest of it. Well, he did go back. And once again the elephant said, "Bopuriso, you have returned a second time. Why? I ask you, why have you come?" "Sami, my lord, I have sold your tusks, but only received enough to clear away old debts. I ask you, give me the stumps of your tusks. I promise I won't return." "Very well, you may have the stumps." And again, The man propped his foot against the jaw of the elephant and sawed away, first on one side, then on the other, until those stumps fell to the ground. Well, off he went a second time. A second time he sold the tusks, the remaining bits of tusk, and then he returned a third time. He said, "Sami, my lord, I have returned, but I ask you, would you not give me the roots of your tusks?" Well, the Bodhisattva, though he was somewhat horrified by the man's greed, he said, "Very well, you may cut out the roots of my ivory tusks." So it was that that man, that greedy forester, climbed right up on the elephant's brow. And he hacked and cut away at the flesh surrounding the elephant's tusks. And he dug out that bit of ivory that represented the roots. And he bowed and he went on his way. But the earth, inconceivable in its vast extent, now burst asunder in a yawning chasm, in disgust at the greed of this human man, and flames shot up from nethermost hell and enveloped the forester in a shroud of fire and bore him away. And the tree fairy who dwelt in those parts, the tree fairy recited a verse. Even if he were offered the entire world, the greedy man still would ask for more. Silavanaka Jataka. So, another one of these amazing stories, a story that we can relate to on different levels. And I have told that story to children and often would preface it with often games and movement where we mimicked the swaying action of an elephant, or I invited them to find their arms as trunks. And then I would ask them, have you ever asked for another piece of pie or another piece of cake? Have you ever wanted to stay up late reading another chapter of your book? And they've all nodded yes, yes, yes. And then we talked about, well, what helps you to recognize enough is enough? What helps you to say, I've had enough? And some of them will say, well, you know, my mom took away my flashlight. I couldn't read the rest of the book. Or my mother said, you've had enough cake, have another piece tomorrow. Or someone helped me because they said no. And by helping me, I learned also to say enough and to say no to myself. So a story inviting discussion, inviting reflection, inviting a deepening and an understanding of this idea of great generosity, great greed, and our own capacity to learn from experience and wake up to our habit patterns, our addictive habit patterns, our compulsive habit patterns. So I'll just share a couple more things and then invite some questions. Here we are. So, image from one of the Jataka tales. So here we have a Cambodian monk seated in meditation. So this monk represents in his posture what we often see is the seated figure of the Buddha. And when I was living in Vancouver Island in Courtenay many years ago, I was given a seated Buddha for my garden. And my friend, Patrick, who gave it to me, he placed it right beside the fireplace, which was a gathering point in our home. And it was a place where, friends came and we played music and we had gatherings. And there was the seated figure of the Buddha. And one day, my partner's son, who was 7 years old, came and he hadn't seen it yet. And he came right in and he sat down in front of the seated Buddha and he said, "I can sit like that." And it really struck me that the invitation in the seated posture is an invitation to anyone who sees the seated Buddha, that Rupa figure, that very familiar picture, whether represented in a sculpture or in an image, an invitation to find our own seat and learn the workings of our own minds. So here, this is again from Sarah Shaw. In a Buddhist context, the recital and hearing of text gave people an opportunity to gather with others who wanted to hear the teachings. It would be a festive special activity outside the usual activities. People would come together, especially to listen to the texts and to let the words work on their minds. So we heard verses from the Dhammapada in the opening words that Kirk shared with us. And a lot of people, and I've learned some of those verses by heart in Pali, simply to let the words work on my mind. And there's one beautiful discourse in Pali. It's called the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the discourse on loving kindness. It's about 10 verses long. It takes about 5 minutes, 6, 7 minutes to recite. And I learned it in Pali and would recite it on my way to work when I was working as a chaplain. And it was, again, letting the words work on my mind. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. So, these texts, these stories, hearing them, letting them work on our minds. So she says, the very act, from the Buddhist perspective, the very act of listening to, reciting, or memorizing a text is a form of bhavana, practice intended to arouse the factors of the Eightfold Path in the very listener. So listening, reciting, and memorizing. So, and many of the stories are related to the 10 perfections. This is another grouping in the Buddhist teachings. These are qualities like generosity, virtue, patience, wisdom, energy. But the first two are the ones that appear most often. People who practice generosity and virtue can follow a way of life that is resourceful, creative, and attentive to the well-being of others. This is action that is kusala, a word that has connotations of goodness, health, and skill. So the stories are like a little reminder when they're told, when they're remembered, and when they're recited. So this is from the Vesantara Jataka. This is one of the Jataka tales that is described as the last, penultimate birth of the Buddha before he was born as the Buddha, when he gives away the royal elephant. So, and then just one final comment here is the Jatakas challenge us to relate our own pasts, or our past to ourselves, from an entirely different perspective. So what is meant by this? Well, this this could be understood in a couple of ways, but one of them is if we think about the incarnations in our own lifetimes. As a parent, perhaps, we were nurturing these beautiful qualities of patience, of renunciation, of kindness, of friendliness, of truthfulness, of generosity, beautiful qualities. But perhaps more than anything, we were nurturing equanimity and patience. Or perhaps as a teacher, there was a very strong embodiment of qualities like truthfulness or energy. And perhaps, in different contexts in our own lives, we can look back and we can see, I worked as a puppeteer, and there was a quality of creativity and energy that was expressed there. I worked as a chaplain, and I was nurturing compassion and kindness and patience. I worked as a teacher, and I had to summon a lot of energy for that job. Or maybe, caring for an aged parent. What qualities were, close to my heart that I was nurturing and developing in that particular episode, in that particular incarnation of my life? So I think about how we can see the Jataka tales as teaching stories that give us an opening and a window into ancient India. We can see them as reminders of our own capacity to let experience offer us, kind of in an improvisational way, an opportunity to practice kindness and equanimity and friendliness. And we can also have a kind of reframing of our past. And often it's quite, it's for some of us, we can have regret, and we can perhaps forgive our unskillful actions and see that there was some insight derived from an experience. And we can see how remorse and regret are actually guiding us to skillful action and skillful behavior. So a few thoughts for you today, a few ramblings and a couple of stories about the Jataka tales. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any questions. Or comments. I'd love to hear your comments.
Wow, thank you very much, Margo. Certainly, you have led us into the heart. The stories you're quite right. They move the heart. So we're going to pass around the microphone so that people who are streaming can hear as well for the questions and comments. So go ahead, Kurt.
Thank you so much for a wonderful orientation to the Jataka tales, and a kind of a way to come into them, and appreciate it. You've really emphasized generosity, and I'm kind of curious, though. It's kind of, on one hand, it's kind of a simple term and all that, but is it different from charity? Is generosity different, like dana, charity, or is it different from compassion, or is it an element of compassion? Could you say more or suggest a story maybe about kind of a deeper idea of generosity? Thank you.
Well, one story that comes to mind is a story that actually is from a different collection of Buddhist narratives called the Buddhist legends. And And what's I think your question is a really good one, and certainly one that scholars of both Buddhism and Christianity have explored, is like, how is generosity, how is that a kind of essential element in the Buddhist teachings? And so the story is about a young woman who was enslaved from birth. She was a servant in the household of the treasurer in Kozambi, who was a disciple of the Buddha. Her name was Kujutara, which means crooked back. And she grew up in his household, and she had an extraordinary gift for listening and retaining what she had heard. And so this treasurer would often send her on errands, and he would recite a message to be delivered, and she would repeat it exactly as he had spoken it. She would travel through the city and deliver the message, receive the reply, and come back. And she had this facility of listening and retaining, and she was attentive to sounds in her environment. Water sound, wind sound, but she was particularly attentive to the sound of truth, the sound of sincerity, the sound of wisdom. And one day, the treasurer actually offered Kujutara as an act of generosity. He gave her, which is kind of painful for us to think of in terms of the slave narratives of the United States and other countries, this passing on of property, a human being as property. But he gave Kujutara to the young queen. And the young queen, Samavati, she was a disciple of the Buddha, but because she was not always able to go and hear the Buddha speak herself, she would send a Kujutara. Actually, I don't have the story quite right. She would send Kujutara to buy flowers. That's how it worked. Kujutara would go to the king's favorite gardener and buy bouquets of flowers. And one day, she was there buying flowers, and the Buddha was giving a teaching. So she heard the Buddha speak. And because of her great attentiveness and this extraordinary sensitivity to sound, but to tone and to sincerity and to wisdom, when she heard the words of the Buddha, she was transfixed, she was transformed. And this is the teaching that he gave at that time. It's a very famous teaching, and it was a teaching on generosity. And just in short, it was, if beings knew what I know about the power of giving and sharing, if beings knew even 1/10 of what I know about the power, the transformative power of giving and sharing, beings would not let a single meal go by without sharing some part of their meal, if there was someone at hand to share it with. If beings truly knew what I know about the power of giving and sharing. So, this day, she heard this teaching, Kujutara, and she spent all the money the queen had given her and came back with bouquet upon bouquet of flowers for the queen. And the queen was overwhelmed by all the flowers, but mostly by the radiance of the young slave woman, the young woman who'd been given to her for her household. And the queen actually knelt down before Kojutra and said, "Whom have you seen? Where have you been? Share with me your wisdom." And Kojutra repeated the teaching word for word. And so it was that she became a conduit. And, the messenger, she became the messenger, but she was transformed herself by the message. So generosity, how do we understand that teaching of generosity? And one way I understand it is that with his great insight and his mind of awakening, the Buddha perceived, and this is actually written up in the stages of awakening, that the last thing that we really have a hard time letting go of is a sense of self. And what we hold on to, represents all the other ways that we hold on. So each time we practice letting go, letting go, of our agenda, letting go of our preferences, letting go of, material resources, letting go of an object that was dear to us, but someone else might be able to use. The more that we actually practice letting go in a very kind of concrete way, the more we are creating the conditions for letting go that is awakening, the letting go of this pernicious sense of me and mine and who I am, the sense of self. So generosity as a practice that can be nurtured and developed. And, it is, of course, very much related to compassion, but perhaps to self-compassion as well as to compassion for others. So a very long answer to your question.
Wonderful story, thank you.
Hi, Margo. Thank you so much. My question actually was, I've come across many different publishers that are publishing Jataka tales, and some I just have a sense tend to be more quality than others, but I'm not really sure. Do you have any recommendation or directions there or publishers that you go to of Jataka tales that you really like and think are very true to original stories?
Well, I translate my own versions of the stories. So, and my translations are based on the Pali text. There are also retellings in some way as well. But you can find some of my translations on Parabola, the magazine. You might know Parabola. So, published, maybe, quite a few on in their magazine. So back issues of Parabola magazine, some of it which are available online. And then Wisdom Publications has published some children's versions of the Jataka tales. So I'd recommend Wisdom Publications. But then Steve Smith, the teacher whom I had the great good fortune to practice with, he was telling versions of the story that were retold by a Zen storyteller named Rafe Martin, and that's called The Hungry Tigress. Those ones aren't illustrated. It's a collection of tellings, and some of them are very elaborately retold. And so those are, a couple of sources for you there.
Yes, thanks very much for that answer, Margo.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
One other comment question that maybe you could respond to is one of the things that we felt as you were telling the stories is that the Jataka tales also kind of create an increased sense of bond with the animal kingdom. and a greater sensitivity to what they might be experiencing in relation to how they're treated by humans. Particularly, of course, the tale about the ox and, of course, the elephant. So I was wondering if you could comment on that as being maybe one of the aspects that, was it intended? Was it part of the intention of the Buddha to kind of increase our sensitivity to what we normally call the lower kingdoms, to have a greater sense of their evolution and their needs and their dependence upon humanity and so on?
Well, remember that, this tradition is a dynamic tradition. So in the, what are called the three baskets of the Pali Canon, the kind of official, formalized texts that represent the Buddhist teachings, there are many times when he says, well, not many, but maybe a dozen or so, when he will say, I will tell you a story of the past. And all those particular, I'm not sure this is exactly true, but I think it is, all those recollections of previous lives, he's telling stories of, previous lives in a human form. So, but the tradition has developed that whether the Buddha actually told Jataka tales, we don't really know. But what we do know is that these teaching stories were framed as the Buddha telling. So, I told you that story at the beginning, the Buddha saying, I was born here, I was born there, and he never said, I was born as a mouse or I was born as a parrot, but that kind of framework invites those later, people who are creating a lineage, creating a tradition. They may be very familiar with Hindu stories. And so they take probably are many parallels. They take a famous folktale from Hindu culture, and they just frame it as the Buddha remembering a lifetime as an elephant. So, but that said, the Buddha is well known for inviting into the order of monks and nuns people from all castes and traditions. And there would be people who had left their very noble warrior, family background and become a monk and join the order, who were rubbing shoulders with someone who came from a completely different strata in society. And so there's a famous discourse called A True Brahmin, where, in a sense, he's poking fun at the Brahminical view of hierarchy, that there are those, those who, we can't even imagine how polluting it would be for them to look upon an outcast or to look upon someone whose job it is to sweep the cemetery. And so there's a sense in which the Buddha, radically inviting a non-hierarchical view of society, inclusive of the animal realm. And these stories representing how later commentators and those contributing to the lineage, how they are working these stories to bring forward that idea of inclusivity and lack of hierarchy, and also that the fact that the Buddha was enlightened under a tree in the forest. And in some depictions there's this amazing serpent who creates a shelter over his head. And many depictions of the animals coming to listen to the stories. So there's very much a sense of a non-separation between human and animal realm. And many later monks and great teachers, the Japanese teacher Kukai comes to mind, who really invite us to see nature as our teacher. So this sense that all of, the animate world and even the inanimate world offers us teachings. And I think that the fact that the story of the elephant, there are other stories where the Buddha is born as a crow, and crows are carrion feeders. And there's nothing that could be more unclean than a crow. So the Buddha in that birth gives teachings to the king. He is offering his wisdom. So this is very subversive, the audience listening hears this teaching given to a royal personage by a crow. And maybe that shifts their perspective. And hopefully it does shift their perspective and opens them to be curious about the living world around them, including crows.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much. Russ has a question.
Hi, Margo. I was wondering if you know the Jataka about the prince who survives the shipwreck.
And I don't know it by heart, but I know it, yeah.
And well, it deals with perseverance and fortitude and overcoming obstacles. And we're wondering if you might share any tale that you know on that theme.
Oh, about overcoming obstacles?
Yeah, that was a good one because it's a shipwreck and he has to swim for 7 days. And
I'll have to look that one up and
and
translate it. Okay, a story for overcoming obstacles.
or perseverance.
Or perseverance. Well, I think you've definitely put me on the spot there. I'm sort of going through the card catalog in my mind. Okay, here we go. So this refers to the work-like aspect of a text that Sarah Shaw mentions in her scholarly work, is that texts, and we can think about Jonah in the whale, we can think about Christian texts that are referred to, and that each of us probably has a story that we go back to that is meaningful to us, that guides us in dark times. And so the story that's coming to mind is about a young woman named Patachara. And this isn't a Jataka tale. Again, it's one of the Buddhist legends. She married against her parents' will. She married a man in the household whom she'd fallen in love with. She left the village to live with her husband. But when she was pregnant with her first child, she wanted to return and have her child in her family home, to ask forgiveness, to reconnect. And she left. Her husband didn't want to go with her, so she left. She set out on her own, but he followed after her, and she gave birth on the road. And so she returned to her own home with her husband and her new child, her baby. And then a couple of years later, she was pregnant again. Again, she pleaded with her husband to take her, and again he was reluctant, so she set off on her own. She set off on her own with her child and with her toddler and her baby. And her husband, again, he went after her to make sure she was okay. But a terrible storm came up, just torrential storm. And so he went to build her a shelter in the forest. And he never came back. He never returned. She took shelter under a tree and huddled there with her babe, and under the tree she gave birth by herself and managed to, well, maybe he helped her when she gave, no, maybe he did. I'm not sure. I'm not telling the story very well. But there she is, alone in the forest with a baby and her infant, her 2-year-old. And her husband has disappeared, and she goes looking for him, and she sees that while gathering branches to create a shelter for her, he was bitten by a snake and was killed. But what can she do? So this, talking about perseverance, what can she do? She decides to continue to her own family home. She comes to a great river, and the river is swollen after the rain. And she's got her infant in her arm and her child on her hip. How is she going to ford the river with both of them? She decides to put her toddler on the bank and to ford with one child at a time. She chooses a place where the river seems depth is not so great. She makes her way across. She climbs up the other bank. She sets her child on the top of the bank. And she comes back and she's crossing the river and she's praying that her baby, her infant, will be safe. She's swaddled the child in a robe. But as she's crossing the river, she sees a great eagle come and swoop down and pick up her infant in its talons, begin to bear it away. And she cries out with all her might to frighten the eagle so that it will drop her infant. But to no avail. But meanwhile, her toddler thinks that she is calling him to come into the river. And he comes into the current and is swept away in the water. So now she's lost her husband, she's lost her infant, she's lost her child, and she climbs up the bank, and she's just overwhelmed with grief. But at least she has her family. She goes to her family home. She goes towards her family home. But along the way, she sees smoke, and she inquires of a former neighbor, what is that smoke? And he says, ask of any household but the one where that smoke is rising, because they have lost everything this night. The house collapsed, the roof collapsed, and mother and father and siblings are all buried under the rubble. So then Padachara goes mad with grief, for it is her own family. And so, perseverance, she really doesn't have the capacity to persevere. She's gone mad with grief. And yet, her clothes fall off her, she wanders naked, and people shoo her away. And at last she comes to the place where the Buddha is giving a teaching. And one of the monks gives her his outer robe, and she's drawn again by the sound of this voice giving a teaching. And she's wrapped in this robe, and she comes forward, and the Buddha sees her whole story. He sees her whole story. The loss, the grief, the perseverance, and the potential for awakening. And he invites her to come and stand before him. And he says to her, "Sister, come to your senses. Come to your senses." And she does. She does. Her right mind is restored to her, and she she understands that she understands where she is, who she is, what she's lost, and her own potential. So she enters the order of nuns, and she becomes a great teacher. And the remarkable story of her moment of awakening is one evening she is washing her feet. You can imagine, the monastics going on the dusty roads. So she's just washing her feet and she's pouring out the water from the water jug. And the water makes a little stream in the dust. And then she washes her feet a bit more, and another stream, and then a third. And the first stream is a long one. And she thinks, oh yes, my parents lived a good long life. And the second stream isn't quite so long. Oh yes, my dear husband, he didn't live a long life, but he lived into adulthood. And then she sees just this few droplets. Oh, and this short stream, that represents perhaps the life of my 2 children. So her mind is opened by these moments of association and insight, and she goes in and cuts the wick on her lamp, and lights the lamp and checks the bed for insects, and blows out the lamp, and at that moment her mind is freed. So that's her moment of awakening. So the preparation, the journey, the loss, the insight, and freedom. So there's a sense in which Padachara's story is a story about overcoming obstacles, persevering, and interestingly, after the Cambodian genocide, many Cambodian refugees came to the Boston area, and Professor Charles Hallisey and one of his students later became a professor herself, Anne Hansen, I think was her name, were interviewing these Cambodian refugees and just trying to find out how their Buddhist practice was a support to them in making sense of the great losses and trauma of their recent life. And what they discovered is that the story that was most meaningful to these refugees was the story of Padachara, and the story of her loss, the story of her insight, and the story of her awakening, of her recognizing her own potential and persevering through great loss. And maybe even that particular phrase of the Buddha resonated with them: come to your senses. So I don't know if that's a helpful story.
It is, thank you.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story.
Very powerful. Margo, we were reminded while you were talking of an author, and maybe you'll know who this is. He was a traveler and a visitor to the regions of Tibet prior to the Chinese invasion. And he lived with some of the nomadic tribes on the Tibetan plateau at different periods. And he said that the most remarkable thing to him was that these massive Tibetan men who were living in the harshest possible conditions, in tents, in freezing freezing climate parts of the year, and surviving on meager rations and trying to raise their families and so on, and just struggling to maintain livelihood or, a kind of a minimum standard of health and livelihood for their family. And that at night, the kind of the crescendo of each day was around the campfire. They would gather and they would, the Jataka tales would be recounted. And that everyone, young and old, would be so rapt in attention. And in some cases, in these very touching tales, these grown men being brought to tears by being so moved by the qualities of the, represented by the tales. And it was a great lesson to him. And certainly also, we can imagine how that would be, as you were describing, a kind of deep bond that would be shared by such communities that would sustain them through, very difficult times. So, and I feel like, you really gave us a taste of that today, that not just in the stories that you told, but the way that you told them. The quality of your voice and your cadence and rhythm and your deep appreciation and love for the tales yourself really came through. And I've heard the story of the Buddha and the three watches many, many times, read it myself many times. But the way you told it was very touching, very moving, and also very accessible in the way that it brought forward the teachings of reincarnation and karma. And I feel like, there was, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but just in the manner that you told these stories and shared them with us, besides the moral content and the kind of transformative aspect of the tales, that you have a way of imparting your own goodness and sweetness to those you're sharing them with. So that's very remarkable. And I personally was transfixed almost the entire time. I was so surprised when I looked at the clock and it was 5:20, and I was, where did all that time go? Yes. So I think the lesson about how a simple tale, when it's told with such, both with precision but also with feeling, in the context of a great tradition like this, that it does have the capacity to bring people together and to create bonds. And that was really the fundamental lesson that we were hoping that we would experience today. So please join me, all of you, in a round of applause for Margo's presentation today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have a couple of more events coming up in May, which is quite unusual for us. On Tuesday, May 20th, we have a in-person and Zoomed presentation coming to us from Ukraine on spiritual values in transformative education. And that's kind of a unique experiment that we're participating with this center in Dnipro. And then on May 23rd, which is a Saturday.
No, it's a Friday.
No, it's a Friday. I knew that. I was just testing Robert. May 23rd at 5 p.m. We're going to have live classical Indian music here in the hall. A classical Indian drummer and sitar player. So we hope you all can join us for that. Thanks again.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Margo. That was, oh, I feel like we've been with the Buddha. I mean,
Well.
literally, I felt like we heard the Buddha.
Lovely. Well, it was a pleasure to share those stories, and I hope everyone has sweet dreams tonight.
Yeah, stories like that give me hope that it's possible to melt the ego. Yeah, that actually that would be what would most heal our society. Is stories like that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and best wishes, everyone.